So today I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Dwayne Estes. He's a full professor at Austin Peay State University in Tennessee. And he's also at the Austin Peay, he is the director of their herbarium there. So he's a hardcore botanist. He's also the executive director and co-founder of the Southeastern Grasslands Institute, that was inspired, like a lot of us were, by Reed Noss's book, Forgotten Grasslands of the South. So I really recommend you reading that book. It's just amazing. And Dr. Dwayne is also involved in the Center of Excellence for Field Biology at the Austin Peay State University. And he's also known as the Prairie Preacher. So today he's gonna really preach to the choir here, saving Southeastern Grasslands, strategies, successes, and challenges of Southeastern Grassland Institute. And thank you so much for traveling here. We've had a great day looking at all the unique ecosystems of Florida and looking at ways we can collaborate and think about restoration of grassland. So super. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, it's an honor to be here. My goodness, we've been traveling, it seems like, for 8 or 9 years now throughout the Eastern U.S. Somehow, travels on behalf of SGI have never brought me to Florida. So, real quick story. When Theo and I first had the opportunity, we ran into a philanthropist in New York City who encouraged us to dream big and create something programmatically to begin to address the issues facing Southeastern Grasslands. Theo and I put our heads together. That's a whole story unto itself. Maybe I'll tell you over beer one day. But the first person that we called after we realized he and I couldn't do this alone was we called Reed. And because Reed really is the godfather and he wrote the book. And so we asked Reed to join us in this effort. And immediately on the heels of Reed, we also knew we needed the expertise of our good friend Alan Weekly at UNC Chapel Hill. And then since then, we built a team that I'll tell you a little bit about. But early on in those days, initially, Theo and I wanted to stay in our lane. We had no preconceived notions of even creating a new organization. It just sort of happened. We were sort of thinking about, well, the Longleaf Alliance has really got the Deep South under control. They don't need us stepping into the Deep South. The Midwestern prairies have lots of organizations that focus on that region. And so we kind of began initially in the earliest phases of thinking, let's stay in our lane. Let's stay completely in the upper South, the interior South, that area between like the Ohio River and the northern edge of the Longleaf Pine ecosystem. Well, we presented that idea to Reed and Alan. They said, hell, how can you consider yourself, Southeastern if you don't embrace the coastal plain? And, that sort of sounded like mission creep to us, right? This idea of embracing Florida and southern, Alabama and coastal Georgia. It just seemed daunting. But we did, thanks to their encouragement, because as Reed points out in his book, there's so many grassy ecosystems in the coastal plain, from Longleaf Pine savanna and flatwood systems and marl prairie, et cetera. We just knew that while we might not work there for another 10 years, we knew we had to embrace it in the concept. So the second thing I want to just say quickly is we have a philosophy at SGI of complement, not compete. That's probably one of the reasons why you haven't seen us in 10 years. It's because we kind of just figured you guys had it under control. And we never want to be thought of as stepping into someone's space. But we like to go where we can help and where we can have an uplift effect. And I'm going to tell you a lot today about, I think, some of the collaborative work that we are doing that is having an uplift effect. And I do look forward to coming back to Florida in the spirit of collaboration in the future. Well, let me just tell you quickly about where I'm from. Florida is totally new to me, okay? I mean, I go to Panama City, have been since, high school, whatever. That's about as far as I've been. This is technically the farthest south I've ever traveled. And, I've had people all day convincing me that I'm looking downhill when I know damn good and well I'm looking uphill. It's totally flat, but they tell me I'm looking down. I've also had people tell me all day that flatwoods are not savannas, and I'm still trying to rack my head around that because I can't conceptually just seem to get it. But that's okay. Back home where things are simpler in Tennessee, my boyhood home is about an hour south of Nashville, Tennessee. The Alabama-Tennessee line runs just south of where you see that yellow star at Sewanee. And there's a few major towns around it you probably know, but most people think about this region as a historically forested region. And that mentality has complex origins. And for me, I first heard it from my 6th grade Tennessee history teacher named Tommy Johns. He told a story about this fabled squirrel that could travel from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River and never touch the ground on account of the continuous growth of mesophytic forest. And I believe that stuff for a long time, probably well up into my PhD years. Now, you see where Nashville is, and Huntsville, and Chattanooga, and Knoxville. What I've actually come to understand, all 4 of these cities were founded because they were grassland cities. They are as much grassland cities as is Dallas, Texas, as is Houston. A lot of people don't think about that. Charlotte, North Carolina is a grassland city. Now, I flew over Charlotte coming down here. You wouldn't know it to this day. When you're up above the city looking out, it looks like a forested city. It's got a lot of trees, but it wasn't always that way. So in this region, you know, our grasslands have unfortunately been gone so long that they have just escaped society's collective memory. And we have history teachers and 20th century leading ecologists and everybody and their mama preaching this message that it was all forest and woodlands. Well, even on this satellite image, you can detect what is largely still forested today. In some cases, what is forested today used to be actually open savanna and open woodland and other types of open ecosystems. But much of what is open today still on satellite imagery, while it is non-native grasslands, pastures, and hayfields, I would contend that if you were to ask most Americans on the street, they would tell you it's open because of why? Because it's been deforested. I would suggest that the relative degree of openness is about the same today as it was in 1780. That the type of open ecosystem has just been transformed into an anthropogenic open ecosystem. I never learned that in my PhD. I never learned that in a single college class. I've pieced it together with inspiration from Reed's book and countless other sources of information in the years since. We still have a lot to prove that case. It's not settled, but I think we're well on our way. Now, you got to realize that southern grasslands, which Reed covers so well in his book, were largely gone before the camera was invented in many parts of the South. They simply were never photographed. They were largely gone before settlers and explorers could note them and describe them in detail. Let me go back to 2013. Now, Reed would tell me that his book was not published in 2013, but it was published in 2012. But just bear with me, right? 2013 was a big year for 2 reasons. In that year, the World Wildlife Fund, God rest their soul, we love them. WWF is a great organization. They and NatureServe published this map of America's grasslands. What? No Florida dry prairie? Doesn't deserve to be on this map? No Alabama, Mississippi black belt? No Grand Prairie of Arkansas, no Piedmont savannas, literally millions of acres of grassland to anybody who wants to imagine their grassland. Just simply, they're not there. I don't like that. So in 2013 was also the same year that Reed's book really hit the big time. And is a major inspiration in our work, for our work. And in his book, Forgotten Grasslands of the South, you know, he talks about the diversity and the richness of Southeastern grassland and the legacy, the antiquity, going back millennia, going back millions of years, in fact, in some cases. He talks about prairie grasslands and savannas, grasslands with scattered trees, bulbs like we have in the southern Blue Ridge Mountains. And I learned today a rosemary bulb. Maybe not a grassland, maybe it is, I don't know, it's all up for discussion. Glades and barrens, rocky types of grasses. It's not the glades necessarily you find in the Everglades. I'm learning we have a lot of colloquialisms that are kind of also, you know, clouding the waters a little bit. We have fens and certain types of grasslands which are almost completely unrecognized in the East, meadows. Very good types of grasslands unto themselves. Marshes and river scour grasslands, which are these really cool grasslands. We actually have our own endemic Conradina. For those of you who know some of the Florida Conradina rosemary species, we have one in this ecosystem 350 miles north of any of the other known Conradina species in the deepest canyons of Appalachia. Now, Reed's book, I've read it 2 or 3 times, but it took me about the second reading until I realized that I should read the foreword, because the foreword was written by the preeminent naturalist and scientist E.O. Wilson. And when I got into that after the second or third reading, and I started reading that 3 or 4 page section at the very beginning, I was gobsmacked at something that E.O. Wilson said now more than a decade ago. Think about all that E.O. Wilson is known for, right? All the books like Half Earth. Think about how many people truly respect him as a scientist and as a person, and he's also a native Alabamian. So I was interested in what he had to say. He said, quote, "The southern grassland biome." I was like, oh my God, that's a term that's like been coined here. When it's properly defined to include the longleaf pine savanna, is probably the richest terrestrial biome in all of North America. To understand, cherish, and preserve the great natural heritage of the southern grassland biome should be a priority goal in America's environmental movement. 2013, right? Same year as the World Wildlife Map. What I thought, having read that several years after this book was published, was it should be a priority goal in America's environmental movement. But for most of the eastern United States, particularly the Southeast, grasslands are an afterthought. We love forests. Forests get all the attention. We love wetlands, particularly forested wetlands. They get a lot of the attention. Coastal ecosystems get a lot of the attention. Climate change gets a lot of attention. Grasslands get the scraps that are left over. But yet, they contribute the majority of our terrestrial biodiversity. When you start thinking about pollinators and insects and rare plant species. So Reed begins to sort of lay some of this out in the Antiquity in his book. But really, it's the words of E.O. Wilson that also have resonated with me. And now I try to carry those words every speaking event I do to say, not only did Reed and I'll say it, but look at what E.O. Wilson also said. So why call them forgotten? Well, as I mentioned, gone before the camera was invented in many cases, right? Here's a good example. This is a painting of a grassland near Montgomery, Alabama, as it would have been in 1775 when botanist William Bartram described that area in his journals. But this could be Charlotte, North Carolina. This could be Bowling Green, Kentucky. This could be the areas just east of Jackson, Tennessee. But let's look at the words of William Foote, who published in the mid-1800s a description of what central North Carolina looked like prior to the year 1750. He says, previous to the year 1750, the solitary cabins were found upon the borders of prairies and in the vicinity of canebrakes. The immense ranges, abounding with wild game and affording sustenance the whole year for herds of tame cattle. Extensive tracts of country between the Yadkin and the Catawba rivers, now waving with thrifty forests, then were covered with tall grass with scarcely a bush or a shrub, the abundant grass luxuriating in its native wildness and beauty. By the year 1750, 26 years before our nation was founded, the grasslands around Charlotte, North Carolina had already begun to convert to forested landscapes because of factors like fire suppression and other types of factors, which we frankly don't always understand. But the reality is we were losing them over 2 centuries ago. So we've been looking at this concept, and this does not apply to all parts. You know, for example, Florida's held on to a lot of its grassland longer than North Carolina has, or Virginia has, or Maryland, or Southeast Pennsylvania has. So that you're going to see some noticeable things that maybe don't quite resonate here in Florida like they might be in some of those other states. But generally speaking, most of the large-scale grasslands by 1750 were beginning to undergo degradation. We have good documentary evidence that the grasslands southeast of Lancaster, Pennsylvania were disappearing by the 1720s. almost completely unknown in the conservation world. By 1800, the grasslands at places like Knoxville, Tennessee, and Chattanooga were also beginning to disappear, or had disappeared, or were undergoing active degradation. And likewise, as we go west until we get to the Mississippi River, most of the big grasslands around Huntsville, Alabama, and the Alabama Black Belt, and the Pennyroyal Plain of Kentucky, totally wiped out by the Civil War. Row crop agriculture. And then you can follow that trend west. Arkansas still had some abundant grasslands into the 1930s. And finally, once you get on out to the eastern edge of the Great Plains in Texas, you still have active degradation still happening, active loss. What we're left with then are grasslands in the east that are found in sites that are a little bit too rocky to develop, too wet to do much with. But even these types of places now, of course, find they can be degraded too, and they have been. A lot of our grasslands are simply hanging out on the edge of something, in a power line corridor or on a roadside right of way. But in the 90s and the 2000s, even those last bastions of grassland biodiversity got hammered by nonstop herbicide application. So what happened in general to the grasslands of the South? Not all types, but there are three large buckets. One, crop fields have largely replaced what once were fertile, arable prairies in certain places. Non-native pastures have replaced what were fertile meadows, like in the Shenandoah Valley, for example. And then dry forests have tended to, what we call artificial forests, have replaced once open, vibrant savannas and open woodlands. These may not work in Florida, as I'm learning today. There's some exceptions here that kind of defy some of these principles. And so what happens when we take 90 to 95, in some cases 99.99% of grasslands off the landscape? As you can expect, we have major collapses in biodiversity. Warning signs. Grassland birds are the greatest group of birds in decline in the South. But if you were to look at these estimates, some of the birds that we would consider to be in open savannas and woodlands are actually classified in the first category under eastern forest birds. So really, you should take some of those birds and move them into the grassland column, and that 53% takes up an even bigger percent of the species that need what Reed would call now open ecosystems. Pollinators, lots of them in collapse. Small mammals in collapse. Thousands of species of plants disappearing in collapse. They need open ecosystems. We have a desire to begin to put together a lot of statistics on the biodiversity of grasslands, and we're just getting started. But I think it's safe to say that in terms of terrestrial biodiversity, at least 50% of our terrestrial biodiversity occurs in open ecosystems. We don't have those firm numbers, but I think it's safe to say that, especially you start thinking about insects and a lot of those other types of groups. The most species-rich plot in temperate North America, 52 species in a lonely pine savanna. Although I think my friends in Missouri have been giving that a good run through. It's 55 species in a quarter square meter. It's ridiculous.
It was.
90 species of bees in a single power line remnant prairie in Starkville, Mississippi. About 90 species of bees in a riverside river scour prairie in Washington, D.C. So some phenomenal levels of biodiversity packed into small places. When we begin to really compare the numbers of rare, threatened, and endangered species, grasslands, for example, in Tennessee, we've looked at the numbers. 60% of all the 440 rare species of Tennessee need open ecosystems. Meadows, marshes, river scours, fens, glades, prairies, savannas. And it's about 40% of terrestrial vertebrate rare animals as well. One of the endemic species of our region is the Sabbatia capitata. If only we had known sooner about the importance of these open ecosystems, maybe the Clark Range High School who are the home of the buffaloes, might still have some buffalo. And not quite, we overhunted those. But they are a grassland species. Schwalbe americana, a lonely pine endemic. We used to have that in Tennessee. Disappeared last seen in 1843 by well-known Florida botanist Ferdinand Rugel. He's the one who collected that specimen. Green pitcher plant. That's definitely a savanna obligate species, federally endangered on the Cumberland Plateau. We also had red-cockaded woodpeckers in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. We've lost those. northern pine snakes retreating from major portions of this range, bobwhite quail and freefall collapse. Many species that were once common just decades ago, not necessarily rare, but are just simply disappearing. New Jersey tea, prairie willow, I could go on with literally thousands of species. And butterflies like the frosted elfin, which are dependent on Baptisias. But we don't have much time left. Flying in over Central Florida, looking at the land from above, it's a depressing landscape as to how much urban sprawl is happening, how much division in the landscape. But Central Florida is not alone here. This is a projection of the type of change of the landscape in our next 25 years. All parts of the South essentially are going to be impacted and affected, some more than others. We've got to act fast to save Southeastern grasslands. So, and Betsy, please give me those reminders, because I know I've gone slower through that introduction than I wanted to. Let me tell you a little bit about what SGI is attempting to do to this problem. We first of all recognize we can't do it alone. We have to have many friends and partners. We were founded in 2018, thanks to being discovered by a philanthropic foundation called the Band Foundation. With their support, we've now grown to a team of more than about 50 employees. That's set to grow to about 60 by the end of this year. And we are firmly guided both by science and history. We feel like if we leave the history out, that's a big mistake for us. That the historical story is not always one that's conducive to scientific study. And we became somewhat disillusioned by the insistence that everything has to be only science-driven. For understanding Southeastern grasslands, it can't just be science. You must have history informing it. And we have a lot of colleagues around the South who push back on that. They say, no, science explains everything. I'm like, I'm telling you, in this world of Southeastern grasslands, we have to consult the historical literature. And you can't dismiss it. You have to pull in those early accounts and those historical records. For us, this is an equal part of our foundation. And again, we have a complement, not compete motto. Now, when we first started, we started thinking about what's needed. You know, we need to educate. We need market-driven approaches where possible. We've made no traction on market-driven approaches. Preservation has to be part of the scenario. Restoration, recreation, reconstruction, whatever word you want to use there. We have to be rescuing some rare plants that are being destroyed. Research is key. We need seed banking and seed development and native plant materials development. All of these are important. We've begun to build a team that is mostly concentrated in the Upper South. We're based in Tennessee, but we've begun to expand out in recent years. Reed's down here in Florida has been a member of our team since the beginning, and we've recently opened offices in Athens, Georgia, Roanoke, Virginia, Little Rock, Arkansas. Our next expansion point will probably be in West Central Alabama. So let me give you an overview of some of the projects that we're working on. You know, sometimes the expression is that it feels like we're flying this plane while we're building it at the same time. The infrastructure around Southeastern grasslands has been wholly lacking. It's frustrating. It's exhausting to have to explain to people why the science doesn't often exist about, like, accurate maps, for example. They just don't. There hasn't been time. There hasn't been a focus. The necessary infrastructure is not there to have reliable, peer-reviewed, published maps. I'm sorry, that's a luxury we just don't have. So I am going to tell you a lot of stuff of which you're going to have to sort of rely on the old prairie preacher here that he's telling you the truth. But you also got to rely on the fact that there's a lot here we simply don't know yet. What you're saying is you're making shit up. Well, kind of. Right. So with one of the things we wanted to do in Reed's book, I'll show you a map in a minute where he presented some maps of where we knew of the largest patches of especially prairie-like southern grasslands. And we wanted to go deeper. We wanted to figure out if we could we accurately determine where southeastern grassy ecosystems are? This is a map that's sort of our, not our latest, but one of the versions we were working on, which is just a simple black and white map, where things in white would be the forested landscapes, true forests that support forest conservative species, including what I would say would be true medium to closed woodlands. with woodland conservative species. Everything in green, and there's a lot of nuance to this, is not all open prairie like Kansas. What we're saying is it's an open ecosystem that ranges anywhere from one of those dozen types of open ecosystems: dune grasslands, sandhill grasslands, savannas, fens, bogs, marshes, prairies. So don't come at me and want to fight me over the fact that nearly 4/5 of Georgia is indicated as grassland, right? There's a lot of nuance there. Just zoom in, for example, over northwest Georgia, and you'll see what we mean by that. You can see the patches of large green, but notice the speckling, for example, over the Piedmont north of Atlanta. That hints at the complexity on the ground, that when you're in landscape suitable for forest, that's where you find them, down in ravines and hollows and north-facing slopes. But you get up on broader plateaus and broad valleys and plains and south-facing hill exposures, that's where you tend to get. The landform oftentimes will dictate which community to expect. So where we are going with this, thanks to funding from our partners at USDA in collaboration with NatureServe and National Geographic, we are slowly working towards a map that will look a little bit more like this. Instead of just a green and white map, it'll show about 10 major kinds of categories. And this is still has a lot of errors and issues that we're going to continue to reconcile. But the point is, it was not all forest, it was not all prairie, it was a complicated mosaic. And that's a complicated story to tell. Now, in the maps that we're to help accurately map where these grass ecosystems were, we have to pull from a wide variety of sources. We are going back into old maps and looking at things like savanna land and good pasture ground over Tennessee and Kentucky. This is the map that Reed has in his book that Dr. DeSalm published in 1993, showing sort of some of the major patches of grassland, the Florida dry prairies down here, for example, Cajun prairie, coastal prairie, black belt, etc. But we knew there had to be more, and DeSalm knew it too, as evidenced by the fact that he would include these stars of grassland remnants. But even Dr. DeSalm, whom I had a chance to know before he passed, didn't know how to really contextualize the presence of those remnants. He couldn't quite make sense of it, I think. I don't think he was willing, or probably still wouldn't be willing to accept that we would postulate that these grasslands were covering tens of millions of acres. In fact, if you go back to that green map, that amounts to approximately 120 million acres of the southeastern U.S. landscape is some type of an open ecosystem. Now, so we have a lot to do with mapping. We are going to be continuing to work on mapping for years to come. The second big thing that we wanted to begin to work on is, let's try to have a better classification of southeastern grassy ecosystems. What we found is that the existing classifications for the eastern portion of the United States were not quite getting us there. We had NatureServe systems, we had the National Vegetation Classification, but depending on where you were, they were really great. And depending on other areas of the South, they were somewhat inadequate. There were lots of gaps. So we published a paper in 2021 that recognized 118 ecological systems of grasslands, and we've been continuing to refine that number ever since. So this is the latest sort of version or compilation that is not published, but we are beginning to move these numbers further and more specifically. So that 118 I just quoted kind of is, if you were to add up all of these various types, that should come to 118. But if you were to go deeper into the National Vegetation Classification from the macro group level through group and alliance all the way to association, there's a profound level of diversity of grasslands. For example, river scour, 17 associations, savannas, 344. Some of them probably need to be merged, sure. Prairies, for example, 83 associations, 41 alliances. Still, that's phenomenal levels of biodiversity. These have to be named. In order for us to conserve them and promote them and restore them, we have to be able to communicate to them. And if a glade in Missouri is different from a glade in Western North Carolina, is different from a glade in South Florida, we can't communicate effectively. And I would also argue that if a flatwoods in Kentucky is not the same as a flatwoods in Florida, we have some additional communication challenges that I'm going to have to wrap my head around. So a big part of settling the classification is we got to get out next to do the field work, right? We have to go to the best remaining grasslands and we have to sample them. This is a grassland you can fall out of. Okay. Not like that sloping stuff you were walking me across today, where I swear I was on flat land. This you can literally fall out of, right? By the way, that's a G1 natural community, Calamagrostis canei seepage grassland, endemic to a single place on Mount LeConte, Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Our team here is surveying marshes, very similar to yours, but they're totally surrounded by woodlands on the Cumberland Plateau of Tennessee. Doing a lot of monitoring. This is the big future restoration site we're about to work on together. But we try to go to the best remaining grasslands so we can inform how these kinds of landscapes should be restored. I'm really inspired by what I've seen here at Archibald today because it seems like you guys are also doing a lot of that critical work here as well. Now, one of the tools that we very briefly talked about today that we're developing, excuse me, I don't have a lot of time to talk about, so I'm going to hit the highlights. Feel free to ask me later for more details, or I can give a future seminar. But we're trying to develop a new tool called the Grassland Fidelity Index. You've probably heard of coefficients of conservatism. How conservative is a plant? Well, that's one measure to sort of gauge the health of a site through the Floristic Quality Index. But another measure is heliophily. How much sunlight does a plant need? So what if you put those two together? What if you have conservative heliophytes, right? What if you have a site that year after year, or every time you monitor, shows an increasing trend in weighted coverage by conservative heliophytes? That actually it says a lot about that site. That might say that that site is increasing towards stability or is stable. It might say that it's a remnant or that it is suggestive of old growth. What if you have a site that is dominated by non-conservative heliophytes, non-conservative sunlovers? I would say that's kind of a weedy, trashy site. You got a lot of ragweed in there. You got a lot of, Bermuda grass. You have sites that are heavily disturbance dependent. So this will be a tool that we're wrapping up and hope to publish that we hope will actually be useful to plant ecologists and community ecologists in helping to determine the health and quality of grasslands. A lot of this work that we are doing, we want to make sure it's accessible and available either through the published work, which we're working on, but also through an online portal. In partnership with ESRI and USDA and the National Park Service, we were just about ready to release this when the federal freeze hit us and hit everybody. This portal hopefully will still be it's still planned to be released at some point. It's called Grasslandia. And we're imagining that Grasslandia will be an online world where you can go and zoom into your location and you can read about the grassy ecosystems where you are. You can read historical accounts near where you are. You can see biodiversity data for where you are, or suggested seed mixes if you want to restore, recreate, reconstruct a site. Guidelines for prescribed fire or prescribed grazing eventually will be built here. We want this to be a tool that not only can land stewards use, but property owners and landowners can use as well as people in the academic community. So publishing is a big part of where we're going. We haven't been as strong as we should in recent years. We've got some popular stuff out. Thanks really to Reed being on our team, helping us do the heavy lifting on some key publications. And we've got a few more coming out, and we're really excited to finally get out this the new map of Eastern Grasslands eventually in National Geographic. Another aspect we're working on, Reed is leading this for our team, is in major conservation planning at a regional scale. For this, thanks to a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and several other partners, we are looking at the Cumberland Plateau of Tennessee, which is about a 10 million acre landscape that we're conducting this sort of regional conservation planning. First, it requires doing very detailed mapping across this land. And that's where we're partnering with a guy named Steve Simone out of Asheville, North Carolina. We're also bringing in historical data. These are all historical quotes. Here's one from 1819. Here's one from 1797. These help to pinpoint the locations of various types of grasslands. We, in some cases, look at these in conjunction with land survey data that indicate where these grasslands were. And here we've got a great overlay of a quote that talks about numerous herds of deer, elk, and buffalo gambling in playful security over these secluded plains that coincides with the land, a tract of land, that has a large abundance of stakes. These are basically often used in places where there weren't a lot of trees for boundary markers. Then you can add to it like place names. So the creeks that flow through here, for example, Glade Branch. A glade on the Cumberland Plateau is an open peat bog or peat fen. And then Meadow Branch was named for the meadow grasslands along those creeks. So these all can be used in unison, and they're helping to clarify that large swaths of the plateau surface were not forested historically. They were savannas and open woodlands historically, with embedded glades and bogs and fens. But this gorge is still old growth forest that should remain intact. And so if you look at these two parts of the landscape, they should look more like that. The tops of the plateau looking like what you see here. When you look at the numbers of species they support in terms of rare plants, those forested gorges, less than 20 species that need closed canopy conditions. But on the plateau surface, more than 120 species that require open ecosystems. Doesn't even begin to get into the animals like red cockaded woodpeckers and frosted elfin butterflies and northern pine snakes and so forth. So there's a lot of recovery that's needed here through better restoration and land management. It's got to be done very carefully. One of the big things that I think we have a lot of lessons to learn from Florida is that we have a lot of seepage wetlands on the Cumberland Plateau. The whole ecotone of those between the wetland and upland has been completely lost. And if you look at all 40 known rare species of open seepage wetlands on the plateau, in the past 25 years, we've lost half of them. So we have a big problem. And so seeing your seepage slope wetlands and some of your marsh communities embedded, there's a lot of lessons to be taken back to Tennessee from Florida, I think, for how to better manage some of those ecosystems. So we're working on continued mapping. This is what the maps are going to look like when they're almost done, about 2 weeks from completion. This is a very fine scaled pre-settlement map at a 6 meter by 6 meter resolution. It's required over 5 years to put these maps together. But when they're done, they're going to be able to really inform this. And we bring together stakeholders and, but we even also bring in artists to help us reimagine the past. Philip Juris, the renowned oil painter, came to this very site and looked out toward the Cumberland Plateau, read the historical accounts, used his experience in training. He's the one that also painted the scene for Bartram's Prairie that I showed you earlier. And this is the recreation of what that landscape would have looked like at about, say, 1775 or so, about 1800. There still are grasslands up on those mountain slopes. We've got some incredible recent studies that have been showcasing, it's not a popular concept, to be honest with you, but in Tennessee, we have too many trees in the wrong places. The wrong trees, too many of them. So by going in and selectively removing things like red maple and sweet gum and several other trees, southern red oak, and leaving the right trees, post oak, blackjack oak, shortleaf pine, white oak, doing it sensitively enough to where we don't screw up the soil, right? And doing it in other sensitive ways, we've been able to recover these ecosystems with 1 selective timber harvest, 3 prescribed fires in a decade. They go from being literally dry, inhospitable for so many species. You can walk through these woods, there's goat's rue that never flowers. There's baptisias that never leaf out, never flower. Big blue stem clumps that sit sterile for decades. Post oaks can't even, their seeds can't germinate or regenerate. But after 1 selective timber harvest and 3 fires from out of the ground, through a combination of both seed bank response and bud bank response, we're seeing conservative species like rattlesnake master, New Jersey tea. It's the only site in the state for a clonal species of serviceberry, Amelanchier spicata, that had been hiding there the entire time, not capable of flowering or setting fruit in the shade of those artificial forests. So this paper, Litter Together, is a great lesson for how we can do it right. The problem is it's being done wrong in a lot of places, and this can be a slippery slope to really screwing some stuff up too if you're not careful. It takes nuance. So in the meantime, we've got loads of conservative species rebounding, thousands of yellow fringed orchids coming back, sundews, half a dozen rare species popping back up on the site. Now, another big aspect of what we do then is through these restoration sites and through remnants, we must be thinking about the seeds that we need. Yeah, this is Phoebe Judge, right?
Yeah.
Used to be one of the interns here. Phoebe was a great team member for us for a couple of years. But, you know, collecting seeds, harvesting seeds for the restoration and for seed banking is an important part of what we do. We have a lot of partners on here. SGI is a CPC member institution. We also partner with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Land Management. These seeds are used for many purposes. First of which is for restoration. This is the prairie that we planted. It was coming out of soybean production back in 2020. At the time we planted this, it was the most diverse seed mix ever planted in the Mid-South, about 77 species. This site is really flourishing now. I'll just sort of show you the processes here from 2019 prior to planting. 2020 we planted it. It goes through sort of a very predictable phase. And now we are managing it carefully with fire. We do have to also treat the invasives. We're monitoring this site. And we're 5 years in on it now. We're also expanding this site up to about 150 acres from the original 50. But seeds are so important. We're blessed to be in an ecoregion where we have access to over 200 species on the market that are local genotype materials. If we were in central Alabama, we would have none of that because those seeds do not exist for that particular region. We've recently been expanding our project. So for example, we have this new 450 acre site. It's about to undergo restoration to all of this. This is part of the Army's REPIACA program. I think I heard Betsy talking about. We're directly across the road from Fort Campbell Army Base. I think we have the second largest intact grassland east of the Mississippi behind you guys down here at Avon Park and Kissimmee Prairie Preserve, which I think is the largest. This is 25,000 acres right here. It's about 10 miles by 3 or 4 miles in the bombing range there at Fort Campbell. So we're rebuilding grasslands. To do this takes team. It takes people. And we went from a team of really 2 or 3 to a team now of several. And I mean, it's 10 great.
I mean, you have 15.
10
but
is
I just,
great. No, we're good. We're good. 10's great. Thank you. So to do this takes people, right? It takes technicians. It takes coordinators. It takes administrative staff. We've been fortunate to be building our restoration and habitat management teams. Here we are doing a prescribed burn back in the winter. And for us, fire seasonality is a big deal. You know, the seasonality here that is preferred, for example, doesn't really work with our particular region. And it doesn't work with our historical fire regime, the baseline as determined by tree ring studies, for example. A lot of our work we have to do with brush cutters and chainsaws, and we have to use herbicide as a tool as well to try to remove brush. Brush and the wrong trees are really the biggest problem, one of the biggest problems we face across many types of remnant grasslands. This is in Virginia, a project we're doing with the National Park Service. We were super lucky last year to be granted a new $12 million grant with the National Park Service to work on 40 U.S. national parks from Mississippi to Vermont to restore 120 sites. Now, I will tell you, it scared us, right? It still scares us at the possibility of that volume of work. Unfortunately, that money and that funding, that project is right now frozen, and we don't know if it will be unfrozen. But as it stands, we are still funded. We've hired the team. They're ready to go to begin restoring grasslands at places like Gettysburg Battlefield, where there were grasslands prior to 1720, or Chickamauga Battlefield, just south of Chattanooga, where there were extensive grasslands prior to the 1830s. We've also been fortunate to build a tribal grasslands program. So we hired 3 tribal liaisons who are each nested in different tribes, different parts of the South. Katie is in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Gabrielle is in Louisiana. Corley is with Eastern Band Cherokee in North Carolina. And they work on behalf of SGI to work with and meet with more than a dozen indigenous tribes across the South and integrate those tribal needs and tribal perspectives into our program with the different projects that we're involved with. Outreach and volunteers are a big part of what we do as well. We just received a new grant to hopefully give this a shot in the arm to hire a brand new director of community engagement. But unfortunately, those monies are frozen. So we might not be doing that yet. But even still, we still have a vibrant program. Outreach is a big part of what we do, getting people involved in the community. A lot of our sites are in the public. They're open for public visitation. So we're working hard to do things like signage, to involve the public in the planting process, having work days in the winter, a great cure for the winter blues. Just a great time all the way around. Here's an example of a public project in downtown Chattanooga. This happened to be a remnant oak savanna with some embedded limestone glades. It's the site of only the 3rd population east of the Mississippi River for the endangered Fremont's leatherflower, Clematis fremontii. From this site, you've got to leave and go all the way to St. Louis, Missouri to find the next population. It is owned by the National Park Service, and this was actually the headquarters of General Ulysses S. Grant during the Civil War in the Battle of Chattanooga. But it's only 2 acres in size. It was being swallowed by invasives. It's in the middle of a rather poor neighborhood, 1 mile from downtown Chattanooga, the most unlikely place possible to find a remnant grassland. But it supports more than 200 native species, including at least 2 species new to science, a new pachyra or ragwort, and it includes several rare species like Baptisia aberrans and Silpium pennitifidum and so many other good species. So we got at this site back in the winter, had a volunteer day. Remnants are precious to us. They need our rescuing and our attention. We got out there, yay, and started working. You can see the city all around us. Just people, the joy on their faces of being part of this, treating those stumps with selective herbicide. This is what it looks like when we were done, when we left. And this is what it looks like when it flowered just a few months later. Saving these sites, stabilizing them so they can live to see another day on our watch, right? That's an important part of what we do. And I'm almost done, thank you. When we started, we were disillusioned by how small our remnant grasslands were, how patchy they were, how isolated they were, how much of an underdog they were. Everything is against them. Not enough science, not enough awareness. People don't believe the message. People don't want to spend the money. No philanthropist wants to do it, blah, blah, blah. We've heard it all. We're sick of hearing it, but we keep trying. But we also realize that we can fight all day long to do that 2-acre remnant and stabilize it and let it live and breathe for another day. But we're kind of kidding ourselves if we think we're making real substantive scalable impact, right? Yes, it's important to me that we do that. That's the reason why SGI was founded. It was around those remnants. But then it hit us that we've got to find a way to scale up. We've got to dream big. And my friends, before we have an altar call to come up here, I fear that our country has given up on big dreams, especially in these times. But I fear that our country has given up on the idea of big grassland restoration. Can't be done. Shouldn't even try. We can't do it. Nobody will fund it. Nobody's going to want to do that. Where are you going to get the money? These are all perfectly valid questions. But even the people who should have hope and vision have given up. That is the other big reason that SGI exists. Because by God, we're not going to give up and we're not going to lose hope. And you can't tell us that we can't go create some large scale grasslands again on the landscape. Now, wait a minute. You're just being naive. Listen, I don't have any grand delusions that we're going to go create a 100,000 acre, highly diverse prairie from seed again in Middle Tennessee. But do I think we can create a 10,000 acre prairie 30 miles outside Nashville, Tennessee, with a highly diverse seed mix, the best that money can buy, and reconnect and have a living testament to what once was, and a stopover place for sandhill cranes, and a place of refuge for grasshopper sparrows? Not the Florida grassland. You better do it. You damn right I do. You think we can also do it in Alabama, or in Mississippi, or in Louisiana, or East Texas, or even Florida? Absolutely. Yes, we can. We're going to do it. And what my mom always told me whenever I disagreed with her, she would say, well, you can hide and watch. If you guys don't believe it's going to happen, you can just hide and watch. Because we're going to do it. But we can't do it alone. We must do it together. We must do it, all of us combined, with many other partners across the South. So we started dreaming bigger than a remnant. From this site right here, about 3 years ago, we met a philanthropist who said, how can I help you? And I said, well, Bob, I'll tell you how you can help us. You tell us, what's the most helpful way? He says, well, I'd like to give you some money to buy some land. Turns out Bob wanted to give about $100,000. That was his price point. We went and bought a 6-acre prairie, which was the last wet prairie of its kind on the Tennessee-Kentucky border. A lot of people would probably laugh at that, think, it's a waste of your time. You ought to see it now. But then 10 miles away, I got a call out of the blue from a wealthy individual who said, you know what, I have a vision. I have a 5,000 acre farm, and I have a vision to right now committing to restore 500 acres, and I'll pay for it myself. I'm going to invest $1 million of my own money, plant the best prairie possible. And you know what? If we're successful, let's grow it to 10,000 acres. I said, man, you're in. Let's do it. So this is what that 500 acres that he has pledged looks like right now. It's all Johnson grass. And there are embedded that's a sinkhole pond marsh right there. Everywhere we see trees are sinkhole pond marshes. Totally obliterated. Extinct ecosystem. Not recognized by anybody in the United States. No intact examples. We just seeded one of those with a mix of 30 local genotype marsh species. So why do I love this site so much? It's Johnson grass. I love the landscape. This land was founded by George Washington's cousin in 1802, part of the second largest tobacco plantation in the nation. Now we're about to begin to restore it and bring back the historical component and the science component as we do it. One other cool fact, there are 2 known bison fords in the Creek Valley right below this site, and the historic bison trail that went right through the middle of it. But we're just getting started. Thankfully, in January of this year, about 3 weeks before we got our teeth kicked in and our shins kicked by having $15 million in federal funds frozen, we got some good news. The National Fish and Wildlife Foundation came calling and said, good news, guys. It's your 3rd try, 3 years in a row, but we're going to grant you your $4.5 million. And the $5.5 million that you raised on top of it, $10 million in new funds called Last Chance Grasslands. So with this, we're going to take that 500 acre plantation, and we're going to take 200 or 300 acres we're working on with Google, and we're going to take the 450 acres across in the Army base and add it to what the 20,000 acres that the base is already doing. And we're going to take it and begin to add 200 to 300 acres down here in the city of Nashville. And we're creating 6 large-scale, for us, large-scale anchor grasslands. These anchors are anywhere from 1 to 500 acres in size. I'm sorry, still not big enough, but it's a start. Right? It's a start. So these grasslands are going to be really important. They're going to begin to form the first corridors. When I come down into Archibald and I went out to Buck Island and I see what's going on here and talking about the work that Reed has helped to promote with the Florida Wildlife Corridor, I almost feel like I'm inspired by what you guys have done here, which you've made possible, that we can do the same up here in my part of the world. Maybe we can do it in other parts of the South too, around grasslands. And in closing, we now have our biggest, most ambitious thing yet. Just 2 weeks ago, and I can't mention the partner, but we have an exciting new project in development, a $40 to $60 million new project to create an 11,000 acre preserve in Alabama, which will be 9 miles wide and over 3.5 miles across. It's got beautiful remnant shortly pine savannas and post oak savannas in here. This is a tornado swath that's over 1 mile wide that devastated those savannas about 10 years ago. Remnant prairies and savannas up here. This farm has been in this family since 1918. It's been burned at least every other year for 100 years. And right in the middle of it are extensive cattle pastures. So when I came here this morning and Betsy began her tour, showing me the ranch, I was inspired by what you guys are doing and what we may be able to do to restore and rebuild portions of this landscape and research it with science and history as well. So we've got a big vision. This is that little remnant that we bought just a few years ago that people told us was a foolish idea, but we helped it to see it through to another day. And then finally, 2 years ago, I was asked by a foundation out of Virginia if they said, look, our founders have just given $50 million to help begin to create focus groups to help come together and think through how to solve some of the greatest challenges in American conservation. Climate change, healthy soils, forest conservation, you name it. And she said, we want to do one for grasslands. We want to do a special retreat and a focus group on grasslands. She said, would you mind chairing that? Would you mind pulling that together? Reed was a part of that, is a part of that. We've called, now we have a team of 55 people nationwide, including some really foundational, important conservationists across the country. World Wildlife Fund, Dayton Duncan, the screenwriter for Ken Burns' documentary films, Jaime Gonzalez, who does grassland conservation work in urban Houston, Marshall Johnson, the COO for Audubon, Sonny Fleming, who works for Esri, philanthropists, artists. It's a big tent. And you know what? We need more Florida representation too. So with this group, the America's Grasslands leadership team, we call it the America's Grasslands Coalition, we're trying to raise nationwide attention like has never been done for grasslands, whether it's Washington State, New Hampshire, Florida, or Arizona's grasslands. They all need love and attention. Finally, come join us in September 2026. We're going to host the Eastern Native Grassland Symposium. We're going to have some great field trips. I hope to see you all there. Thank you for your time. Yeah, I did.
That's okay. It was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions?
Yes.
Sure.
We'll go first, Frank.
Okay, so you mentioned buffalo and elk, but there's also clues to former grasslands and bird distribution. Pinewood sparrow has a disjunct population, someplace in Tennessee, I think.
Yeah.
And clay-colored sparrows used to nest in Ohio with loggerhead shrikes. And Swainson's warbler has a disjunct population further north. And last but not least is the prairie chicken called the heath hen that was on Martha's Vineyard. So how does that prairie chicken get to the eastern Atlantic? It must have had continuous grasslands all the way through. So I think there probably are other bird distribution clues also.
I agree with you. And we also had greater prairie chicken, not the heath hen subspecies, but the typical Midwestern type in Kentucky. Audubon's illustration is from Kentucky, by the way. And we had it in Tennessee. And then there's 10,000-year-old archaeological remains of prairie chickens in northwest Alabama in Dust Cave, which is a cave on the Tennessee River. So I agree with you. All those are the kinds of evidence that we're pulling together to help inform grasslands. Yes.
Well, first of all, you got me ready to run through a wall for grasslands. Really appreciate it. You're a great storyteller. And I really appreciate the being driven and guided by the history too. That's really neat. One question about you had shown some of the paintings of what the historical grasslands would look like, and then some of those quotes from the 1700s of how things were already changing. So the question is do you see that there is any chance that there was kind of natural succession of that change over time, and then the large changes have been kind of a process of being perpetuated by anthropogenic kind of factors? Like, do you think the fact that some of that change was happening before large-scale human kind of population here, do you think there's a process of natural succession and change of grasslands?
Good question. I do think that there was some waning of grasslands, largely in response to megafaunal collapse at like 13,000, years ago with the Younger Dryas period. We see a huge die-off in many species of big animals, right? That must have precipitated some beginnings of collapse. And of course, by the time we begin to see the massive die-offs of Native American depopulation in the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s, that undoubtedly would have affected indigenous management of landscapes. So I do think those factors were significant. And then, I think we are still on the cusp of understanding. I have friends in Missouri who've got some pretty profound ideas. Maybe the uptake in usage of fire has actually had a deleterious effect on landscapes. It might have promoted woody invasion, or it might have promoted somehow the degradation of systems. A lot of people have always said, well, these are early successional ecosystems. We would strongly urge all members of the academic and society, whatever, stop calling these early successional communities, right? Because grasslands at their core, when they're functioning and they're healthy, they're stable systems. Now, some of them need fire according to some stable regimen, or they may need megafauna at some stable regimen. But when you start introducing soil disturbance and fires that are mistimed, or land clearing that's mistimed, you're going to disrupt and destabilize the systems, which could make them, more easily invadable, and thus we see the whole collapse of the system we've seen. So it's complex. I explored in my natural history class, full semester length class. Let me know if you're interested. Back here in the back.
So considering the public perception of fire and all that, and you speak of a lot of places where you can have small mesh parks, is there an intent to burn all of these areas, or are you considering leaving some areas burned and unburned and monitoring the species success?
Yeah, we're having no problems right now burning in urban areas. So we've actually had some very good, Google allows us to burn right next to their data center under power lines, and they help. It's pretty cool. So I do think it's very important for us as an organization to be super cognizant of the burn window. What is the appropriate burn window for our geography? And I think not enough people are asking that question. The notion that all fire is good fire is not an accurate assessment. We have very clear incidences across the South where too much fire is leading to the complete wipeout of conservative species. They don't return in some cases. On this 11,000 acre farm in Alabama, there's not a hint of hazelnut, crabapple, hawthorn, New Jersey tea, Carolina rose to be found, because they have been burning almost every year for 100 years. That's not the way it should be. And there's also no violets, no Indian paintbrushes, no conservative spring species that should be present. So I do think there's some mistakes, and we're trying to be very mindful about not burning at the inappropriate time, but also trying to build our resources so we can monitor effectively and know, are we doing it the right way or not? And then also there's just a lot we don't know. We are going to make mistakes, and it's okay. Hopefully we won't ruin a remnant in the process, though.
So here you are in Florida,
Uh-huh.
and listening to your account, one can almost feel fortunate in Florida, in the sense that we do
I
have
agree.
vast grasslands, which the public seem completely, even though they drive through them every day, don't seem to realize they're vast grassland. And you know, I think fire and flooding and marginal soils had a huge amount to do with the fortunate position that, you know, inverted commas, that we find ourselves in. The landscape at which we've been able to protect grasslands, you mentioned Avon Park and Kissimmee Prairie, we have tens of thousands more acres in that complex now gone recently into easement, so it's a huge block. What I wanted to ask you is, you didn't raise the question of closely working with agriculture, which is where we've had to, where we have formed this sort of confluence of common ground. So, I obviously got you into the right. So, you know, you didn't mention you were working with each state's cattlemen's association, for example. And for us, that's been absolutely critical from a conservation, but whatever your views on cows are, there's, you know, the recognition without the cattle industry and without wide scale, you know, land use.
I'm so glad you brought this up, because I forgot to get to my last slide. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, you got
But I think I know where you're going. Yes, I've had a full-scale epiphany. In fact, when I saw Reed last night, I said, brother, we got to sit down. We got some stuff to
He's
talk about.
already been
Well, when I was, I asked Betsy to stop at the store today so I could get a cold drink, and then I noticed this big chocolate chip cookie, because this morning I couldn't find a picture that satisfied me. And I said, I've got to get this cookie. Here's the reason why. The chocolate chips in this cookie are remnants, the best remaining intact grassland that we have left, right? The precious few that we have. The M&Ms or whatever those things are potentially these big chunks like Avon Park, or the big place in Alabama that we'd like to restore, right? Those are select few places. It's like my friend in Tennessee who said, I don't mind spending $1 million to make this the best grassland again. But you know what? That's not practical in the rest of the Southeast. The cookie is the matrix. It's the surroundings around the remnants and around those fortunate few chunks that we can restore with the best that money can do. But we've got to embrace the cookie. We've got to, well, help to better manage our pastures and our hayfields. If we're in crop country like Iowa, we need crop filter strips, right? We need to be absolutely working with farmers and producers and ranchers as part of the solution. And I had a friend of mine who kind of woke me up to this about 3 months ago. He said, I'm in this meeting and all I hear about is remnants this, remnants that, conservative this, conservative that. What I want to know is, what are you doing? Is there a place at your table for someone like me who's working in primary agricultural landscapes? And it really shook me. And I said, absolutely, absolutely there is. And that, I think, is what I'm most excited about for our future, is how do we bring them both together in ways that make sense? And the answer for me on that is by forming an exciting new partnership with our own foundation, with our university partner, and a host of many other partners around the Southeast. Maybe Archbald is one of these partners. It's going to take a coalition. And so I was super excited to see what you guys are doing with the ranching community here today. I think there's lots of lessons that we can take back to use in our work. And thank you for your question.
It has been quite interesting working with the cattle industry in other states. Florida is looked at by the rest of the industry as an exception. How are you being able to do this?
Right.
So I think there are some really important lessons to learn there, just on the, you know, the long term it's taken to build that relationship.
Yeah, one other, just a cultural item is that Florida often, you know, like parts of the West, you know, the word ranch is a common thing. Culturally, ranching is connected to the culture, and the term rangeland is still quite often used. It's an official designation in most of the West.
You do know that Central Florida is the only piece of rangeland in the West,
Yeah, exactly.
West,
but if you go anywhere outside of Florida in the South,
yeah,
we don't use rangeland, and we don't have good synergy between the ranching farming community and grassland conservation, and we need that. very much so. Thank you for your question. Thank you, Betsy, for having me. I appreciate you.
I think one more question.
One more
and then
question,
we'll
okay.
go out and have a break.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, this is a crazy question. So I've been in many places in Florida where all the rare plants and the rare insects I work with are in a little strip along the edge of the road. And back from that, there's all like, it's like all laurel oaks or something.
Yeah.
So this is probably a common phenomenon everywhere. Is there any way of taking advantage of this? Can you make those into corridors? Do you hunt for those as seed sources? Is there some way to use that?
All the above. The one challenge is right now, several colleagues and I across multiple states have absolutely been just hitting our head against the wall. Because just when you think you've gotten the right partners to agree to stop mowing or spraying that roadside, there'll be a shift in the position. They'll hire someone new in, they just forget like it never happened. They'll come in, totally go back on everything you just agreed to for the past 3 years. And this happens everywhere all the time. And when we first started, one of our big grants was with the Tennessee Valley Authority studying grasslands and electric transmission line corridors on the Cumberland Plateau. Hands down, there are more rare species in those power lines, grassland conservative obligate species, than anywhere else. They don't even exist on public lands. They're in those power lines. But because of the perils of being in the power line, the susceptibility to these stochastic factors is just, you're going to get destroyed. It's just a matter of time. So I'm losing hope that these corridors can stay in place because of the propensity to just be, there's no consistency. Now I think we must insist. We must insist. Because a lot of these go through public lands. They're not being properly managed. They go through private lands that could be better managed with resources. But I don't think we should continue to put our hope and faith in these little bitty 20-foot wide scraps. We need to demand and insist that the land managers whose lands that those corridors go through get their shit together and do a better job. Because the last of America's most precious biodiversity, that these grasslands, are clinging to the edge of existence in many places. I'm sorry, guys, I get a little heated about it.
All right.
It's a
Thank you.
blasphemous prayer, Rich.